Hello, welcome back. It is a great pleasure and honor to introduce Brandon Jourdan, who describes himself as a journalist and a filmmaker, and in 2011, I believe, founded Global Uprisings, which is a collaboration with Marianne Mackelberg. It's a real pleasure in many senses to be here, and I think Brandon is, apart from the extraordinary list of organizations that he's worked with and committed and engaged organizations, he's, I think, one of the few people who, over this time, has been moving in an engaged way between the various different sites of struggle, at least where they've erupted. So I think there's a very special place that he can give us. Anyway, I'll give it to you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a real honor to be here, and it's kind of funny. The last few years, I think I've been shot at. I've been hit with the water cannons from Atoma. I've been beaten up, and this is actually one of the most terrifying experiences of any of that, to kind of be back here. And I think it's also because this is the fourth time that I've been in Egypt, and it's hard for me to work on one of these films without sort of kind of an emotional connection to people and places. So being back here, it means a lot, but it's also, in some ways, I feel a lot of pressure, in a lot of ways, and didn't really even know what I was going to say, and didn't really even try to fully prepare anything today. But the way I decided that I would talk today is, I'm going to do a brief introduction to the project for people who are not familiar with it, and I'm going to talk about how that we've done the literal translation for all these films, and then we're going to go into more of a discussion of sort of discursive translation, and the translation of the meaning of different movements, the ideas behind them. And then sort of the last part of the talk, I'm going to kind of talk about what is untranslatable. I'm not a translation studies person at all. I didn't go to film school. I'm not like an academic. So forgive me if I kind of just speak in a kind of a clear manner. And I'll go into some theoretical stuff, but don't be mad at me if I can't answer everything. And in fact, the Q&A, I'd rather be open up to more of a discussion about these social movements, about the kind of lessons that can be learned from them, and ways that we can kind of proceed forward. I'm not going to talk too much about film, though, because for me, this is just kind of a way that I am allowed to kind of talk about political movements and ideas for action. So Global Uprisings, as Khalid said, is a project that me and my partner Marianne Mackelberg did over the last few years. We've made 25 different films in Belgium, Egypt, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Greece, Portugal, Spain, Turkey, the United States, and the UK. And I filmed most of them, and Marianne and I wrote and edited them together. And we did, of course, have to use some archival material, but for most places, we tried to be there in the heat of the moment. We did collaborate in some places, like here with Mousserine, with Occupied London and Greece and like other collectives. And filmmaking is always a collaborative process. To make these kind of films, what we did was we tapped into our sort of networks that we built over the years. Both me and Marianne were active in the alter globalization movement in the late 90s and early 2000s. Afterwards, I actually was more tapped into things happening in the Middle East. I worked in Palestine. I made a feature-length film about the war in Lebanon, and I also produced 2 half-hour documentaries on the war in Iraq. But through like all these travels and stuff, we established a network of people that could refer us to people to talk to and interview. And I will say very clearly that there's definitely, even though I am a journalist and whatnot, I can't say that it's purely objective, and I don't think that there is a purely objective form of journalism or filmmaking. I think they're objective forces, And I also don't want to say that it's purely subjective, that it's just purely my opinion, but also there's a sort of positionality, I think, that we've taken based on our kind of political connections and our background. But the thing that's been kind of amazing about that is it's given us a sort of access and a trust, I think, which has allowed us to kind of be able to give a kind of clear picture of sort of these kind of movements and places that we've been. And through that, we've been able to get things translated. Marianne's much better with languages than I am. She speaks 6 languages. I'm kind of restricted more or less to English, some really bad Dutch, some awful Spanish, and really nothing else. So don't, ask me too much about translation, but we have been able to get things translated into, just because of the kind of the global reach of these movements and the sort of places that we've been able to get our films translated into Mandarin, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Arabic, Turkish, etc. And I think that's really kind of has to do with the kind of immediacy of the films and whatnot. So actually, before I switch into this idea of kind of discursive translation, I know a lot of people haven't maybe seen any of the films, so I'm going to show one 20-minute film, if that's okay, just to give you an idea. And this is actually about the aftermath of Gezi Park, and actually a little bit about the sort of situation within Turkey, the political economy of Turkey, the support base of Erdogan, and the sort of kind of breakdown of the peace process with the Kurds that happened recently. And this is the second film, actually, in Turkey that we did. The first one was called Taksim Commune. And all these films, I got the website open, and it's globaluprisings.org. There's 25 films here. They're all free. They're also fair use. So as long as you're not making a profit, you're actually able to download them and use them however you want. So that's the kind of process that we've done. We tried to crowdfund and keep it as independent as possible. So I'm going to show a quick film, and then I'll continue talking.
Political struggles over the future of Turkey have left the country profoundly divided. Former Prime Minister, now President, Tayyip Erdogan, has fueled the growing polarization through his controversial policies and his government's repressive response to political opposition. In May 2013, a popular uprising spread rapidly across the country after police used extreme force to evict protesters who were defending Gezi Park from demolition. The rebellion was met by Prime Minister Erdogan with over 130,000 canisters of tear gas, rubber bullets, water cannons, and in some cases live ammunition.
Ama 31 Mayıs'ta büyük bir Türkiye'nin hiç tanık olmadığı da gece çadırlarının kaldırılmak istenmesi, aşırı devlet şiddetinin uygulanması, insanların o biraz önce söylediğim siyasal atmosferde de biriktirdiği öfke, özellikle Alevilerin kendi üzerinde hissettikleri baskı ile birlikte 31'inde başka bir durum yaşandı ve bir gezi isyanı. Yani
insanlar buna karşı direnmeye başladılar. Türkiye'nin her yerinde sokağa çıktılar, itiraz ettiler. Evlerinden çıkıp tencere tava sesleriyle seslerini yükselttiler. Esas olarak gezi böyle başladı. Ve Taksim Meydanı, Taksim Gezisi bu mahallelerde, çeşitli parçalarda süren mücadele deneyimlerinin, mücadele pratiklerinin ortaklaşabileceği, buluşabileceği bir merkez olarak kurgulanmaya çalışıldı. Ve bu sayede biz 15 gün süren bir komüne sahip olduk.
Yani öğrencisinden sporcusuna, spor taraftarlarına, işte memuruna, işçisine her kesim etkiliyordu hükümetin bu faşist davranışları.
Ve o meydanda aslında yan yana gelmez denilen çok ciddi toplumsal kesimler, işte Kürtler, Türkler, Lazlar, Çerkezler, feministler, LGBT'liler, Aleviler, işte dindarlar, herkes yan yana geldi, antikapitalist Müslümanlar. Türkiye'de 3 milyona yakın insan sokağa çıktı aynı anda. İzmir'de, Ankara'da, işte Eskişehir'den tutalım Çorum'a, Malatya, her yerde, Dersim'de.
What we have seen in Gezi was another way of politics. It was not directly related with the elections or with the ballots, or you know, it was not related with the parliament. The people just take their lives to their hands and they decide for themselves.
Erdogan's swift and violent response to the protests has been fueling political unrest in Turkey ever since.
What we can say about police brutality in Turkey is very increasing and increasing. A few days ago, Erdogan said that I cannot believe how the police can behave like this, because he wants to say that if I were the police, I would kill them all. The language of the media and the language of the state is encouraging the brutality of the police. The ones who were killed in Gezi protests, like Ethem or Ali or Ahmet, the murderers are known but still not arrested and still free. As this is known, the police doesn't hesitate to use gas or directly attack to the people who are on the streets. And there are a lot of people killed by the police since few years.
For many people, the Gezi protests were the first time they experienced violent police repression. The Kurdish movement, however, has faced much worse for over 3 decades. The Kurdish struggle for independence has faced paramilitary executions, imprisonment, torture and military occupation.
Yani Gezi'de Türkiye tarafı ilk kez devlet şiddetiyle karşılaştı. Şimdiye kadar hep Kürdistan'da 30 yıldır yaşanan savaş çatışmada devletin uyguladığı bütün o devlet terörü, devlet şiddeti Batı'da hiç görülmemişti. Çünkü oraya uygulanan işte terörle mücadele ediyoruz. Oysa hak ediyorlar gibi Batı hiçbir zaman Kürtlerin ne yaşadığını, 30 yılda yaşanan insan hakları ihlalleri, faili meçhuller, köy yakmalar, ölümler üzerinden hiç bu tarafı sorgulamadan insan hakları savunucuları bu konu...
Not only the Kurdish population, but also the Alevi population has faced centuries of persecution in the region. The Alevi faith has been under attack in Anatolia since the Ottoman Empire and has played an active role in resistance movements in that region. In the Gezi uprising, the Alevi communities have been among the most active and most heavily targeted by the police, with most of the Gezi martyrs being Alevi.
İşte son dönem AKP'lilerin Aleviler üzerinde yeni bir politika gütmesi, bir yandan açılım tartışmaları yürütmesi, bir yandan Alevilerin sinir uçlarına dokunacak işler yapmaları Alevileri sokağa çıkarttı. Daha çok da öldürülen çocuklar, gençler neredeyse hepsi Alevi. Bu da bir algı yarattı aslında. Berkin Elvan'ın en son cenazesi başbakanın bana uyguladı deyip cemevi önünde Uğur Kurt'un öldürmüş olması da Alevilerin bu tepkisinin haklı olduğunu gösteriyor. Dolayısıyla Türkiye'de Aleviler kendilerini çok hissetmiyor, güvende hissetmiyor.
The Gezi protests started in response to the redevelopment of Gezi Park and the Taksim area in central Istanbul. But these two projects were only one part of Erdogan's large-scale urban redevelopment plans. In the year after Gezi, resistance to enormous construction projects continued, this time with a focus on the plan to construct a third bridge across the Bosphorus and a third airport, which Erdogan claims will be the largest airport in the world. Erdogan chose to name the third bridge after the Ottoman Emperor Yavuz Sultan Selim, who is known for ordering the massacre of over 40,000 Anatolian Alevis.
Türkiye'de kentsel dönüşüm dedikleri şey esas itibariyle bir büyük talan. Sadece yoksul mahalleler açısından böyle değil, bütün kamusal alanlar açısından böyle. Kentlerin bütün müşterek alanları açısından böyle. Su kaynakları açısından böyle. Orman alanlarımız açısından, bütün doğal varlıklarımız açısından böyle. Otoriterleşmeyle yani demokrasi sorunuyla, demokratik haklar sorunuyla kentsel dönüşüm bahsi yakından ilgilidir ve AKP hükümeti özel olarak burada gaza basıyor. 3. Köprü, 3. Havalimanı projeleri örneğin İstanbul'un son doğal ekolojik rezerv, yani son doğal rezervlerini, son orman rezervlerini, son su rezervlerini ateşle imtihan ediyor. Gerçekten çok tehlikeli bir şeyle karşı karşıyayız.
They are building the new airport and the third bridge and the connecting highway to the north of Istanbul, which is on the Black Sea coast. And for that, they are just cutting a million of trees down and raising totally whole villages out of the land. The basic demand from the people in the Gezi was to stop the government and to stop capital from touching their places that they are living. And the third bridge and the connecting airways and the third airport is almost the same, which will be the end of Istanbul. And this is the reason why people gather here, because this time it's not a Gezi Park or any other park, another small neighborhood. It is whole Istanbul is under state.
Erdogan has used Turkey's economic growth as a way to maintain power. But this growth has emerged through a bubble fueled by foreign investment. When the economic crisis hit Western powers and the US Federal Reserve introduced its multi-trillion-dollar quantitative easing programs, investors turned to developing economies like Turkey rather than risk investment into the crisis-ridden US and EU markets.
On global crisis, Turkey solved their own problem easily, much more than in some European countries. They have started 2010 growing because foreign sources in Europe, they cannot find investment areas and turn to Turkey. And also with this win in 2010 and 11, economic growth up to 10%.
Ve ABD'deki kriz öncesindeki şişmeye benzer bir şişme gözlemlenebiliyor. Ya da herhangi bir karşılaştırmalı incelemeye gerek yok. İstanbul'daki konut stoğu açısından bir şişme olduğunu çıplak gözle görmek mümkün. Daha da önemlisi çok fazla spekülasyon yapılıyor gayrimenkul sektöründe.
This construction-led or construction-based capital accumulation strategy can really be dated back to the beginnings of the AKP regime, to this very stable regime of the last 13 years, the one-man regime. The construction sector saves the Turkish economy from crisis. We sometimes call it, my colleagues from the Urban Studies Institute, that the accumulation strategy, the economic strategy of the Turkish economy is based on construction sector. So it's a construction-based accumulation strategy. So while the Turkish economy was growing for 7% in 2008, the year of the big crisis, global crisis, the Turkish construction economy was booming, was growing for 16%. You can imagine this is nearly threefold boom in the construction sector. So, I mean, you can see it in Istanbul. Just go around in Istanbul, you won't encounter any place, any neighborhood, any street where there is no construction work going on. In all these construction projects, mid-size and big-size, holding companies are involved, which are never solely construction companies. They have one hand in the mining sector, like the Soma Holding Company, which has brought to the coal blast in the Soma area. In Soma, in the Aegean, near the Aegean coast of Turkey, 301 people died. So the scale of this accident is the biggest in the Republican history of Turkey. It has invested the capital accumulated in the mining sector in the construction sector. It has built the second highest skyscraper in Istanbul. The state itself, one can say, has also become a company, a huge company itself. It invests in the construction sector. It owns the biggest construction company of Turkey, which is TOKİ, which was originally established in order to build social housing. Its name still is Institution for Social Housing, but it builds, it rents to big companies state lands. It builds itself football stadium, concert halls, shopping malls, and so on and so forth. It really is a big actor of the construction sector.
After 12 years in office as Prime Minister, Erdogan became Turkey's first elected president. Historically, Turkey's president has been chosen by parliament, but in 2010, Erdogan held a referendum to allow for direct electoral vote for the office of the president. When Erdogan stepped down as Prime Minister, he hand-selected Ahmet Davutoglu as his successor, who was approved unanimously by Erdogan's AK party. Critics claim that Davutoglu's loyalty to Erdogan will allow Erdogan to continue to push his own political agenda. Erdogan also hopes to change Turkey's political structure from a parliamentary to a presidential system, thereby extending his own rule beyond the maximum 12-year limit. Despite making sweeping changes to Turkish law and growing accusations of authoritarianism, Erdogan maintains strong support among conservative sections of society.
Erdogan is the best example that says I succeeded. You can also succeed. Erdogan himself was born here near in a neighborhood which is near Taksim. Taksim was the cosmopolitan European-oriented Kemalist neighborhood. Just, 10 minutes walking time, it was a traditional, more Islamic-oriented working-class neighborhood. His father was a captain, a simple captain, and the son has become a prime minister. To these people say, see, I have succeeded. Now, Europe has to listen to me, Israel has to listen to me, and all these Kemalist elitists has to listen to me. I have succeeded without speaking English. I have succeeded without going to university. And I'm the richest person. And this is the first generation of messages, and it really gives these messages to these people.
Critics accuse Erdogan of creating a system of clientelism, where those close to the regime receive economic rewards and those critical of the regime are discredited and attacked.
I'm very uneasy to define it as a cultural crash between an Islamic regime and the enlightened middle classes. I think there are class issues, there are distributional issues at stake. You need to be close to the regime. So there is an enclosing system, no way out system, that at some point or other, at the local sphere or urban sphere or supra-urban sphere, you need the tie to the political regime and to the type of the cultural expression of this regime.
Although Erdogan appears to be consolidating power in the electoral sphere, seeds of resistance have become more widespread since the Gezi uprising. Among these new political projects are local neighborhood forums and squatted community spaces like the Don Quixote Social Center in Istanbul.
Daha sonrasında biz geçtiğimiz Ağustos ayı gibiydi. Yani Yelderimi'nin mahallesi olarak, dayanışması olarak ne yapacağız? Yani kışın bu forumlar parkta veya işte açık alanda olmuyor. Arkada bir otopark vardı. O otoparkta yazları forumlarımızı yapıyorduk. Fakat kötü havalar başlayınca işte yağmurlar, işte soğuk havaları falan da öngördük. Bu binayı zaten mahalleli olarak biliyorduk. 25 senelik boş metruk bir bina.
In the occupied houses, we saw the examples of like barter bazaars and common kitchens and this kind of experiences that people bring what they have, they bring together and they give to who need.
In the years since the Gezi uprising, at least 2 factories have been occupied and self-managed worker initiatives have emerged.
We see the effects of Gezi protests in the workers' movement. The examples of Graif and Kazova is very important because the values which became popular in Gezi, like self-organization, has had the ground to flourish.
Prior to the Gezi uprising, Erdogan used the ceasefire with the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, as a personal political triumph. The peace process has broken down as the Turkish government chooses to escalate hostility towards the Kurdish region in southeastern Turkey and Syria, especially in northern Syria, also known as Rojava. Rojava has become an autonomous region with experimental forms of democratic self-organization.
The Kurds took up the political power in Syrian Kurdistan in August 2012, and since then they've been trying to impose a new administration. And this new form of administration is based on equality and participation from bottom up, and equality between different religions and ethnic groups living in the region. On the basis of the main principles of equality and direct participation, they have founded up some local councils in different scales, on the neighborhood scale, in a town scale, or in a regional scale. Yet, of course, due to the war conditions and due to political rivalries that is going on between different political groups in the region and in Syria, administration based on egalitarianism and direct participation, of course, are not implemented fully as it should be the case.
The border region between Turkey and Syria has become the iconic battleground for the Kurdish people's fight against the Islamic State.
There are heavy clashes between the Kurdish protection units, which are called YPJ and YPG, and ISIS, or the Islamic State. Until now, Kurds in Syria, they have been resisting very successfully against all kinds of attacks their own land be the attacks by ISIS or by other radical Islamist groups supported by different regional powers. They have been using mainly guerrilla tactics, and they have been quite powerful actually in defending their cities, because most of the YPJ fighters, if not all, are locals of the region.
While the Turkish government has made statements claiming it will support the US-led war against the Islamic State, it has directly and indirectly been supporting the IS in their battle against Kurds and the Assad regime.
They opened their borders to anti-Assad, Salafi, Jihadi or radical Islamist groups in order to enter Syria, the Syrian territory, and to fight against the Assad regime or to fight against YPG. And, they facilitated their passage, as I said, to Syria. They facilitated their movements across border, back and forth. When you look at the responses of the Kurdish people in Turkey towards Kobani, actually not only towards Kobani, but towards Rojava, Western Kurdistan, people have been responding in a very critical way towards government's policies.
Angry protests and riots spread quickly across Turkey in solidarity with Kobani. These protests were met with a swift police response that has already resulted in the deaths of dozens of people. At a time when the border between Syria and Turkey has become the grounds for an international war, and powerful allies are turning to Erdogan and his AKP regime for support, the political future of Turkey and the potential for meaningful political change is more uncertain than ever. Despite formidable obstacles, people in Turkey still have hope for a world beyond the politics of fear, repression, and despair.
We can change. We can have another way of society, having the bounds of sharing and solidarity instead of a competitive and a selfish society, a capitalist society.
So, I'm not going to talk about this film at all, really. But I mean, it's kind of, I was sort of hesitant to show it for multiple reasons. First off, it's incredibly wordy, and somewhat, it's translators. Yay, translators. But yeah, it wasn't subtitled. It was more talking heads than usual. But the reason one of the reasons I ended up deciding to show it is it actually shows a transition that's happened in a lot of the countries since the sort of movement of the squares, which is one from where people come together under this kind of loose affinities against a common enemy to more of a sort of uncertain situation. And Turkey is, to a lesser extent than Egypt, shifted into a more authoritarian situation where the Gezi Park protests were pretty much crushed. But luckily there are still kind of seeds of resistance that were kind of planted by that. Of course, the situation in eastern Turkey and in Syria, no one really knows what's going to happen. So anyway, I thought I would just show that just to give an example. And this is, like we said, there's 25 films like this that we directed together. We just kind of have been choosing to kind of make them kind of fast. This one also used a lot more archival footage than we usually use. All the interviews I shot and everything, but generally I try to shoot most of it. But anyway. So I want to talk about discursive translation within these kind of global social movements. And it seems like a lot of times the media is very, very quick to point out the sort of local kind of issues. And I think those things are important. I mean, there was a talk this morning where people talked about you can't really generalize and do this reductionist standpoint and say like everybody is, fighting about the same thing. I don't think that, but I do think that sometimes it's a good idea to step back and look in kind of I'm going to unplug this so you don't look at my notes. It's private. To sort of think about things in a bigger framework. Coming from the ultra-globalization movement, there was this kind of nomadic group of people that were going around, and they were opposed to the policy of these transnational kind of de facto world government institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization. And it was very limited in character because there was only, there were people that had the privilege and the ability and who were educated about these issues and also had the freedom to basically go and do this. But one character of it that I thought was quite positive was that it was an internationalist movement. And the thing about these sort of local movements that kind of really started to erupt with the financial crisis in the United States, which became a real crisis, especially in the West, there was kind of sometimes just a soft nationalism, but in other aspects more of a real nationalistic tendency. And in some ways that was a real limitation. And I think in some ways, I think we had a discussion last night about Gezi versus the Egyptian Revolution, and someone was saying, well, with Gezi we had, and I agreed with part of it, but they were saying in Gezi people said we're trying to basically distance themselves. They're saying we want to push out Erdogan because this was something he was using to kind of discredit the protests. A lot of people some people tried to keep it to critiques about the park. And then there was qualms about the police. Some people, of course, had more of this agenda of actually trying to bring down the AKP regime, but and then as opposed to here, where there was this kind of switch into the people want the downfall of the regime, and they were saying, well, maybe it was better that there was this, that people learned in some ways, and and then I think actually, a gentleman said yesterday, maybe it was actually they pushed too far and they had too much. They wanted too much in Gezi. And I actually have this crazy standpoint that nothing was taken far enough. And the way I say that is that if people, it's also, everything is reflecting a kind of the material reality and the historical moment that you're in. Of course, it's going to be hard to get people in the United States who have qualms about the financial crisis and about the distribution of wealth to want to overthrow the government. But once it gets to that, if it were at that point, I think that when people in Egypt fell, that people would have been able to easily pick them up and carry them on and carry them further. If we kind of look at this in a transnational way, it's $1.4 billion a year that is coming from the United States into Egypt. And if we actually had been united and had enough potential, then we could have actually been able to halt the kind of flow of capital going into supporting these other authoritarian regimes. But anyway, I'm going to step back and let's talk about why, in my opinion, this kind of global movement happened in the first place, and this kind of discursive translation that we tried to apply within making these films. We saw that what happened really in 2011 was a real legitimation crisis. And when I refer to a legitimation crisis, the real meaning of it refers to a decline in the confidence of administrative functions, institution, or leadership. And this kind of crossed boundaries, be it authoritarian regimes or representative democracies in 2011. Once Tunisia set off and spread to Egypt and spread throughout the Arab world, people in anti-austerity movements within Europe, in a lot of ways, began occupying their own squares and kind of connected it to their own basic issues. And in this way, this also spread to Occupy. And then even in Turkey and places like Brazil, where there was actually economic growth, people also, and actual democracies, also kind of connected it. And I think that was a legitimation crisis. But then I think that there was also a lot of economic factors which were unexplained by a lot of media in a lot of different sort of local contexts as well. While there has been this sort of, there was this economic crisis in the West, and it definitely had a more major effect on, say, the United States or, say, the peripheral European economies. There were some things that were quite similar in a lot of different places. For instance, in Turkey, there was also a substantial youth unemployment rate. While there was significant economic growth in, say, 2009, there was a slight recession, but in 2010, there was upwards 8 to 10% growth in Turkey. But still, there was over 20% youth unemployment rate, and there was overall unemployment rate of 10%. So this economic growth did not lead to economic development for young people and for a large part of the population, which was just a surplus population. You can also see similar kind of economic reasons in Brazil. Also, of course, during the Arab Spring, you also saw this kind of same sort of economic situation. So there was this part of the participation within this thing, which was the sort of youth. There was also the kind of surplus population, which never really had this kind of social contract that the middle classes had. And that's kind of like been also, I think that's going to be something that's going to repeat itself in the future. If you look at what's happened in the United States right now, where mainly African Americans are upset about the complete impunity of the police force there to be able to kill black men without consequence. This type of population has had high unemployment figures for a substantial amount of time. So there wasn't this kind of social contract. And then you've also seen riots that happened in Sweden, the riots that happened in London. So this legitimation crisis also extends to this sort of what people would term in political terms as a surplus population, one that's basically pushed into positions of precarity or unemployment. And, continuing on this kind of discursive thing, when you really look at what happened really since 2008, this thing had been building for a while and really building over the past 40 years. And, people like Thomas Piketty, when he wrote his book, he sort of dismissed the kind of Marxist concept of this decline in the rate of profit and all that in his look at sort of like the increasement of inequality. And personally, I don't think that this actually throws this away at all. If you actually look at sort of the global GDP within the real economy since the 1970s, there has been a decline in the rate of profits in manufacturing. This led to outsourcing. This led to financialization. This led to an increasing dependence upon debt, both private and sovereign debt, as a way to continue profit motives. And this recent crisis has only increased the amount of sovereign and private debt. So I think that this is another reason that I think people are having trouble trusting their governments. They're lacking trust in the economy, and I think this has been almost universalized. And now during this crisis, one of the reasons I showed this film too is you talk about Turkey and the amount of growth that happened there. You talk about the amount of growth that happened in the BRICS. A lot of that there was capital inflow from quantitative easing and from like European Central Bank and stuff, and investments were going into these economies, and these economies are going to slow down. And now the Saudis and all these other people are still kind of keeping the economy afloat. But I mean, how long can this last? Now, this kind of like idea of crisis and whatnot, I don't want to say this is the economic crisis was the main motivation behind every single person who took the street. That's not exactly true. There was also there definitely was a lot of distrust in police and like people come to the boiling point for their own kind of local reasons. But I think it's important kind of background when you look at this in a bigger historical context. And it's really hard to look at it, really from a distance because it's really very recent. And I think it's also really hard to call like this sort of like an endpoint to any of this. We don't know what's going to happen next. And I don't know. I'm not an economist. I dropped out of college. I can kind of edit a little bit. I definitely can't predict the future. So that's just a little bit, about this sort of thing. And I think that, this kind of reality like translates in a lot of different ways. Even most people didn't like here in Egypt. Most people, when they look from the West, they kind of saw everything here as this sort of striving for this kind of representative democracy that the West had. And I think we can see now that that wasn't what the aim of it was. And that actually, if you look at the history of Egypt, even though there was different sort of pace of events that happened, over the past 40 years, there have been a lot of economic structural adjustment, really starting with the Intifada in the the Intifada in the 1970s under Sadat, the increase in that in the 1990s with the IMF, World Bank, sort of structural adjustment stuff. Anyway, there's a lot of commonalities between all this. Anyway, so that I think translates across contexts. I hope I'm not rambling too much. I mean, are you guys able to follow me? Okay, cool. I like some feedback too. You guys can yell or clap or laugh, or I don't know, airplanes, whatever you need to. So I'm going to finish up and open it up for questions, but there's some things about like all these movements which I think are untranslatable. And you know, I actually came to the Middle East about a month ago and did a tour through Palestinian refugee camps in Jordan and Lebanon, and then I went to the West Bank. And it was the third time that I had actually been through the Middle East, and my third time in Palestine. And I'll be quite honest, you know, it was really emotionally stressful. You know, in Jordan and Syria, I could feel the kind of dark shadow of the Syrian civil war looming over me and looming over everybody. And being back here in Egypt is also really hard because there's a lot of people that they weren't like interview subjects. They're people that I love and care about, and the people that Marianne loves and cares about. And this is something that's untranslatable. It's a sort of affinity and stuff that's built up between people. And there was also this aspect of things when we were here at a high point where there's something in the air that kind of feels like it carries you forward. And there's something in the air now which is like untranslatable. And I think that it's kind of beyond these kind of political reasons and everything. I think it's up to all of us to kind of carry our way through this. I mean, I really enjoyed like hearing you talk early and talking about this. You know, we can talk about revolution and we can talk about all this thing, but it's quite abstract. You know, the decline of rate and profit and all this. But when it's actually real, it's like I can't write this down on paper and describe it. And I think that's worth mentioning, that none of these films, none of these papers, none of these discussions here can talk about and explain in clear terminology this kind of like untranslatable ideas. And I think right now, at this period of time, in this kind of lull, there are some things that we should be thinking about. I think we and you were talking about earlier the difference between nostalgia and reflection. And right now I think is not a time for nostalgia, no matter how hard we want to be, but a time for reflection. Because given the uncertainty of the global economy, given the uncertainty of when the next explosion is going to happen, it's important for us to reflect and us actually to start think about something beyond the rupture. And what I mean by a rupture is when these kind of explosions happen and create this kind of power vacuum. Because what happened in a lot of places is the power vacuum was created, and sometimes the military may step in. Sometimes all-out chaos may break out, such as in Syria. Sometimes there may be a return to politics or an emergence of new left parties, like this happened with Podemos and Syriza in Greece and Spain. But I think that we need to actually learn to create, to communicate, and reproduce new ideas, new forms of life, new ways of thinking of things outside of traditional politics, new ways of thinking. If we're opposed to capitalism, let's actually think about how are we going to function beyond that. I think that economy is defined as a mechanism for allocating resources to produce goods to meet consumption needs, and capitalism is not actually a mechanism for allocating resources to produce goods to meet consumption needs. It's purely for the production of profit. And any type of social welfare state or anything is based upon GDP growth. And if there's not growth, this dries up. And the first thing that's going to be cut is resources and stuff that goes to the people that need it. And in economic growth means environmental destruction. It means exploitation. So I think that we need to actually be able to actually produce and create a new language and be able to translate that. And I think we have to go from kind of the sort of things that happened within the last few years of occupying public space, to kind of challenging the role of private property, to challenging the sort of selfish system which has been put in place, which we've had no control over in our own lives. I have one other thing, but my computer went to sleep. And I mean, well, actually, that's about it. I mean, the thing is, I can't come up here and tell people what to do. I can't tell people in Egypt who've suffered a lot of losses, and people are going to court and are being put in jail for a long time. But I can say that, you know, we can't forget the significance of these movements. We can't forget the significance of the martyrs. We can't forget the significance of these moments where we have attempted to do something different. And, you know, it's not up for me to decide. It's not up for these people in this room. It's up for us all to decide. So let's just open this up for discussion. Let's actually talk about something beyond like filmmaking or translation and all that, about different ideas and things for the future. But anyway, thanks a lot for, you know, giving me a few minutes to talk.
Thank you very much. Questions? I have a question.
Sorry, it's kind of loaded.
No. I don't know whether to start with the big question or the small question, so maybe I'll start with the big question. What does solidarity mean to you?
What is what?
What does solidarity mean to you?
I mean, the first discussion was a lot of it was about place, and you know, being between places, and I feel like I'm between places a lot. So solidarity is a kind of a hard concept for me, you know, because in some ways I feel like sometimes I feel like I have too many faucets on at once, and I'm not getting enough water pressure. I feel kind of spread out across the board. Mm-hmm. So solidarity seems in some ways kind of this abstract thing, and to me, like, internationalism means not feeling like you're doing something in solidarity with someone, but you're doing something with someone. That doesn't answer your question. But.
Well, I mean, I guess part of the reason I'm asking is also in relation to the work that you do. Would you describe the films as acts of witness, or would you describe them as acts of generating solidarity and allowing a narrative to grow? Or because it just from the outside it feels like a lot of the traveling between spaces and the belief in certain ideas, and also maybe it's another issue to bring into it, but the fact that you're American, the fact that you live in Oakland, the fact that there are a whole lot of things which seem to feed into the work.
I think that when we started making the films, it was really just out of general interest. You know, I went to Greece and filmed the general strike, and this was after the 18 days here. And it was like a question of whether this type of anti-authoritarianism here would resonate in Europe. And then once going there, I saw that there was something beyond this kind of general strike that happened, but there were these daily acts that were going on. Be it it was a migrant hunger strike, there was the movement called I Won't Pay, where people were not paying for highway tolls or public transport. And there were these kind of rolling strikes that were happening. And the intention of the first movie was to kind of take something that was not, trying to make something that wasn't like a long-form doc, but also wasn't just a one-off news story about one specific strike or whatnot, but to give people a little slice of like what was happening in a lot of ways. And I think that we made it in a weird way for myself, but also for other people that may have this kind of like general interest, you know, in this type thing. And then like going back to this discussion about how everything was so, in a lot of ways, became very localized in 2011. It was to kind of give people some ideas of what people were doing in other places, and also trying to take away this kind of mask of like that everything was really specific to that place and was nothing in common with what they were doing. So maybe in some ways it was to kind of build solidarity, but it was actually to build understandings of like what people could do, or like things that might be applicable in people's situations, and also to sort of like make something that was relatable to people. So I mean, maybe that's solidarity, and then actually, you know, there was this other aspect of kind of making the films that we started doing chats, kind of Skypes. We would take a couple people that were in the films, and it was actually first time I was in New York, and Lubna chatted in from here, and then we had some people from Greece chat in and talk to people with Occupy Wall Street, and then we did that a few times, and then this foundation offered to give us some money to do a conference, and then we tried to bring 50 people from 5 different continents together to have a discussion. So I think it was trying to be kind of something a little bit more than just a witness. I think it was also trying to build kind of connections, like in a real way. Of course, it could have been better, and I mean, you know, it's a process. That answer your question?
Yeah, definitely.
Hi, thank you so much. And I mean, I think you're being very modest in your claims around solidarity, because from what I've seen, you know, foreigners coming, for example, to Turkey to make films, trying to make sense of Gezi and after, I have reason to trust your solidarity networks and connections, and the people who show up in a Brandon Jordan film around a given issue, I feel has everything to do with very strong international networks that you've created over time. And for example, you would go back to Turkey after everybody has forgotten about a tiny little month-long uprising, right? And try and make sense of it. So first thing I want to say was thank you, and how impressed I am with the Global Uprisings Project. But the question I have has to do with form. I mean, I know you identify as a journalist, though not in a particularly traditional sense. But there's a way in which, when you're talking about new models, imagining otherwise, challenging us to envision futures and future possibilities, new strategies are necessary. New strategies are already developing in activism. But there's something almost traditional about the form of the documentaries that you're making, with the voiceovers and, you know, kind of certain type of authority and the talking heads, the archival footage, etc. And I'm curious about how you reconcile what I consider to be real incredible political insight and forward thinking and imagination. Fantastic solidarity networks and all that are really amazing. And what I think is a more familiar or traditional form. Okay.
I mean, that's fair enough. I mean, it's pretty simple, actually, the way the form happened. I mean, actually, before the Global Uprising, I never used a voiceover. The only reason we started doing that initially is because it was for Democracy Now!, so it had to be for radio. So it kind of developed in that way, and actually I did the voiceover for the first one, and then I was hoarse for the second one, so Marianne did it, and then she just had a better voice. But we did 3 films without a voiceover. A VMA documentary, which is a documentary about an occupied factory in Thessaloniki, and then a film called Pieces of Madrid, and then we did the Bosnia and Herzegovina and Spring film without a voiceover. And for me, I'm not actually married to this form, you know. Like, actually, for me, I sometimes I get kind of depressed, and Marianne kind of has to cheer me up because I'm watching Chris Marker films or Johan Vanderkerken films, and I'm like, I'm just being really lazy, and like, it just looks like the fucking BBC or something. But sorry for the bad language, but you put me on stage for about an hour and then I'm going to start cursing. But yeah, I mean, it really was just actually that it was, and the only reason I say I'm a journalist because I have a paid to do journalism, you know, and I actually would sometimes be in a place that Reuters or something might buy clips from. But I mean, I know, you know, I'm obviously not like a J school person from Columbia and following like the all the ethical standards of the New York Times, but I don't really care, you know. But I mean, yeah, the form just basically just happened to do with that. And I think we're going to do a long form film, and we're going to do something different without the kind of voiceover. And I'm excited to do something different, just because I think it became really formulaic. And but there is I think there is a value in it, in that it's very accessible. Like this last film, I think that we just showed was more rhetorical than some of them, but we still tried to be kind of a little bit dry. But it was definitely a straight-up editorial about Erdogan for the most part. And the other ones were, like the one about Gezi, where the tone was a little more dry. But it was accessible, I think. Like people could kind of sit down and they could watch it and they could understand it. But like I said, I do feel embarrassed when I watch these. Like, I know you weren't insulted. You were like incredibly nice to me. I don't mean to sound so. No, of course.
Next question.
Brandon, only because nobody is asking questions, so I'll ask a provocative question.
No.
Okay, I'll be honest, this is something that came up around a discussion of one of your films in Madrid. And it's the whole issue of riot porn. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering what you think about it, or if you know what your thoughts are about the whole riot porn debate in terms of representing protests and representing movements, and you know, what does it give us and what does it take away? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry, because you were looking at me and I was like, wait.
No.
Yeah. So that would be, you know, if you feel like it, if you want to think a little bit or tell me how you handle that in terms of when you're deciding what to include and what not to include.
I mean, the thing that we try to do, I mean, you'll notice that in just about every film there's a riot, except for a few, you know, but one thing that I try not to do, and like I used to, like when I came from the indie media days, it was all the usual response was basically showing police repression. Right. It was showing somebody getting the hell beaten out of them by the cop and just putting a clip up on the internet, and then you get like, you know, 100,000 views and you felt pretty good about it, you know. And I don't know, for some reason that was like over victimization. And then there's also the aspect that you could just put up a video of a riot or whatnot. And I mean, I've tried to a certain extent to kind of do the best to kind of contextualize it, but at the same time, no, I'm not going to edit it out. You know, I mean, even let's just say if, like, say March 22nd in Madrid, for instance, you know, there was, I don't know, 1 million to 2 million people, and everything happened for about 6 hours, and then like the last hour of the day, there were clashes between mainly kids from Vieques and the police and some, you know, other elements of the crowd. But I mean, like when we did that film, I tried to at least do like 3 or 4 minutes of that, and then really actually the riot part of it was about 1 minute. Mm-hmm. And proportionately, I felt like that was fair. I mean, it was, but at the same time, you know, I actually don't have a moralistic standpoint when it comes to violence. Mm-hmm. You know, I don't want to overly fetishize it, but I do think that it does happen. And then sometimes, and when things actually go through, I mean, when things happen here, one can't say that it was purely nonviolent. One can't purely say that things in Oakland, you know, or like that, or anywhere else. So usually I leave it in, you know.
Right.
But I don't try to just make the whole thing like one after another with like some heavy metal or something, you know, and you know, it's like 20 minutes of riot footage.
Well, and also because the film footage is actually can be useful in terms of actual judicial things or denouncing police brutality, but at the same time it's also used by the other side to present evidence in court against protesters and so on. So it's interesting to see how, we were talking about earlier about strategy and violence in the panel this morning to think through how when the legal context changes, as it is now in Spain, where it's going to be illegal to film the police committing police brutality, it's illegal to film them doing that, then I think that just is just a comment, not a question, but I think that then also shifts the debate around the inclusion of images of police violence in our documentary footage of social movements and of protests.
I mean, there's two. This thing actually brings up a really important part, actually, of like. I think there's like this. The last like few years has been this over fetishization of like documentation and like the truth will set you free and like unfiltered media, which I'm gonna curse some more. It's bullshit. You know, I actually like having a filter, and it actually can maybe save someone's life. You know, like when we published March 22nd stuff, I went through frame by frame and blacked people's faces out. Right. Because you actually have to think about when you put something on the internet, and if you stream something, and if someone does something illegal, you may put them in harm's way. And then the other part of it is like, you know, it's still like is important, I think, to show police brutality because, you know, sometimes that'll motivate people to go to the streets. But you also have to, there's a fine line between, you know, pushing people emotionally in the street and making people scared and terrified.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to kind of balance it. And I mean, even though that I do, like I say, like I do think I have my bias, I do actually try to be as factually correct and honest in my capacity as possible, you know. And I think that happens in you know, in a demonstration or movement. There are moments that are scary. There are moments where things may get out of hand, and then there's the content of why people are there, and I try to do that the best I can. But I can't, you know. I mean, I'm not gonna. I'd get, you know, everybody in this whole room would probably laugh at me if I said I was nonpartisan.
There's another question there.
I want to thank you very much for the film. It was really fantastic, and I want to commend the work, especially that you did post Gezi. What we've seen thus far of this film is really a great critique of what's happening in Turkey. So thank you for that. I wanted to ask you, how does your films, and you mentioned this a little bit in your talk, but how does your films speak to the role of the third voice, or concept of non-binary politics that people can fall into, especially in Egypt and in Turkey, and that third voice or another voice, a way, maybe a space of creation, and how that would connect to the idea of revolution and social change. So.
The third voice again being
something that doesn't fall into the political binaries that for example, in Turkey it's generally Kemalism versus Islamism, right? Or in Egypt it would be primarily brotherhood versus the military, and the concept of a revolutionary space that social change, a real social change, could be envisioned. I feel like maybe there's a movement toward that in your work. I wanted if you could discuss that.
Well, I think, like, you know, my partner Marianne's really, Mona knows her work, her writing about prefiguration, and I'm not as much tied to the concept of prefiguration. I think actually, but I, you know, I dabble in it, you know.
Can you explain what you mean by prefiguration?
Prefiguration is tying to practice the kind of politics and sort of things that you want to see in the future world. But to me, there's a real limitation to that. You know, like you can't say that that all the squares or something were the vision of the future world. You know, and some of the Occupy camps, there were sexual assaults, there were limited resources. There was a lot of reproduction of the same kind of social relationships that exist within capitalism. But what we try to do is, like, there was this old model within the Spanish Revolution which was called revolutionary gymnastics, and I like that kind of better, because what happened in the build up to the revolution was actually revolutionaries would kind of take over spaces or take over towns and try experimentation with things, in the hopes that they could begin to experiment and learn ways, but they were trying to, like, push it further. Because I think the thing is, like we talked about last night, is kind of when you're in a public park, you don't have a well for water, you don't have the ability to make shoes, you don't have a way to grow crops. You don't have all the things at your disposal, and I think that for us to actually push forward to, like, a real transformative process, we actually have to build up to a point where we can actually seize those things and figure out a way to kind of run things differently on a large scale. Because on a small scale, you can very easily be crushed. But I still like to highlight the sort of little examples throughout the world where people have done this kind of revolutionary gymnastics. Be it the sort of temporary space that was created in Gezi Park, where people were giving away things for free, where there was this kind of commune kind of like atmosphere, to the sort of self-managed factories, like the one that we made the film about in Thessaloniki, to the sort of neighborhood assemblies that were happening in places throughout Spain and Greece, to the like many different examples where people were acting on their own without any sort of like coercion. And I think that it's important to show that even if it is for only a brief moment of time, that there is no set human nature. But at the same time, understanding that we're still kind of within capitalism, and there is no real autonomous subject at this point in time. There may be like some place way out in the middle of nowhere that hasn't been touched, but for the most part, everything has been globalized to a certain extent, and we're dependent upon like the sort of capitalist system of capitalist economic system. But anyway, I don't know if that answered you, but a lot of the films we tried to highlight it. We didn't try to just purely focus on the critique of political economy or just like this happened, but tried to highlight little interesting things that were happening, I guess.
There was a question at the top. Do you still? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my question in a way follows on the previous question. I mean, because, and we were talking about this yesterday already. I mean, so with your other film, Taksim Commune, right? I mean, you were, in a way, like in that film, you were more talking about the communal elements of the occupation of Gezi Park and the fact that, everything was provided for free for anyone who stepped inside the park. Food, water, medical supplies, that all of these things were sort of, provided free of charge, that market relations were in a way, suspended within the park. And that was the case in other, occupied spaces to a certain extent also here in Cairo. But what's happening, in Rojava is, on a totally different scale, right? I mean, because this is first of all, territory that's much larger, geographically speaking, that has been liberated both from the Assad regime and from the Islamic State. And the experiments that they're sort of beginning there, I think, are much more far-reaching in terms of, introducing equality between men and women in all of the the municipal council, the village council, the regional councils, etc. And also the level of solidarity in a way. I mean, if you think of the refugees that have sort of been crossing the border between Syria and Turkey and are being taken care of largely by like the Kurdish political parties in the region and not by the Turkish government. So I was just wondering why in this film, after Gezi, in a way you sort of focused like less on those the sort of communal experiments than in the Taksim Commune.
It's pretty easy to answer that. I didn't go. I was in Istanbul the whole time, and actually most of these interviews were shot in May and June. The interview at the end where we kind of throw in Rojava, I had to actually hire somebody in Turkey to film that interview, and we kind of tacked it on because I moved to California in the process, and this took the longest of all the films. Actually, it took me 2.5 months to make it, which to me was a really long time because my whole thing with making these films has been to suffer as much as possible in as short a period of time and get it done. And but I moved in the process. It took a little bit longer. Then it became very complicated once Kobani was under siege by the Turkish military and the Daesh. So but I think actually I had the ambition to go and actually make a separate film about it. And actually wanted to do something kind of different, maybe even do a cinema verite film there and just kind of follow around meetings. Because there's a lot of discussions about it. There's been a lot of arguments about it. There's been some people like David Graeber who's been really, and Janet Biel who have been really endorsing it. There's been some kind of left communist kind of critiques of it. And so I think it would be actually useful just to go and film it and just kind of show it just as kind of a slice of life. And avoid the rhetoric and actually show a little bit of the kind of to what extent the kind of democratic autonomy is happening. I mean, not just in Rojava, it's also as we talked about last night, in parts of eastern Turkey or northern Kurdistan too. So yeah, I think that'll be a separate project. And I mean, if you see this last thing was I thought I was going to lose my mind because it was trying to tie together too much. It was surplus capital being invested in urbanization, the mining, the Gezi Park, the history of the Kurds, the levees, and it was really, really hard to shove all that into one 20-minute film, and it felt really too dense. And I think sometimes it's actually best to give people space to think, and didn't do it as much. But at the same point, I wanted to do kind of an editorial about Erdogan. So I think that was the focus of it,
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it was great. In my personal opinion, I think that this issue of democratic autonomy is exactly what has not been covered enough in other documentary films or in traditional reporting about the conflict, which usually focuses on Daesh or the militarized conflicts that are going on in Syria, rather than this new sort of democratic experiment. So. But thank you.
Upcoming Global Uprisings film.
We have to wrap it up, so I don't know if there are any more burning questions. But if there aren't, then I will ask one last question, which is the way in which maybe because I know you live in Oakland. Mm-hmm. And you've made films, I believe, about Oakland as well. Mm-hmm. So I'm just wondering, having been in all of these places and then doing a film in Oakland, whether it was the same experience or a different experience, or how those two related.
Oakland, when we did the two films on Oakland, it was kind of different in a weird way, because Oakland was somewhere I lived actually before I moved to Europe. For a short period of time, and it was actually one thing that was most people who looked at kind of everything that happened in regards to the U.S. and Occupy, they left a lot of the local context out of it. They kind of just purely connected it to things happened with Occupy Wall Street, and then it spread to Oakland, but I'd been there when there was. After the financial crisis, California was written about in the papers as the Greece of the U.S. because there was a huge budget crisis. So in the U.S., the way that austerity worked, here not here in Europe, it was more on a nation-state level. There it was mainly on a state level. There wasn't this kind of national austerity stuff happening so much. But in California, the University of California had this budget cuts, And this led to tuition hikes, and there was a very radical wave of student occupations in 9 schools. And actually, before Occupy Wall Street, there was this kind of slogan called Occupy Everything. And it actually meant that, you know, there was a lot of people that were kind of reading this kind of like communization theory and stuff like that, and they were actually like encouraging people to kind of like occupy everything. And so coming back, you know, going back to Oakland, it was weird because I kind of felt like I did a full circle. I'd been in Europe, and you know, and then I came here, and then I came back, you know, and it was like a full circle. I kind of came back around, so that was kind of interesting, and it was different in a weird way because these were people that I'd known, you know, longer. But now it's kind of weird. It sort of feels like we're all kind of neighbors in a weird way. But I know I'm completely out of touch with reality because I travel so much. I mean, completely out of touch. So I don't know.
And on that note,
yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much. That was really great. Thank you.
Oh, thanks a lot, man. Thanks for,
okay, we have 15 minutes, and from now on, everything takes place in this space. There are no more parallel panels, so everything is here, and we have 15 minutes, and then we'll start the next session.